I think it should be obvious by this point in the week that I'm pretty fascinated by this whole descriptive and this idiom that Peter uses to talk about Jesus as being the foundation stone, that he's the most precious and valuable stone. He's the cornerstone by which we measure everything. And now he adds in the end of verse 7 another dynamic of who Jesus is. He says he's the capstone. Now, a capstone is really kind of the direct opposite of the foundation stone. It kind of ties into that the statement that Jesus says, I'm the beginning and the end, the first and the last. Because the first stone that you put down is the cornerstone upon which you lay out the foundation stones, and everything is built upon those foundation stones. But when you get to the end of the building, especially if you're talked about something like a pyramid or an arch building, the very last stone that's put in place is in many ways the most valuable because it holds everything together. I mean, this is one of the amazing discoveries where we used to think that the Romans were the first to figure out how to build arches made out of stone. And it was interesting because they would have to build basically a scaffolding as they placed the carved stones into these positions in kind of an arch. And then they had a final stone, usually somewhat V-shaped, that fit exactly into that space. And the amazing thing they found out was that the weight of that stone gravitationally was transmitted to all the rest of the stones and held them firmly in place. And so, when we talk about Jesus being the beginning and the end of our faith, that's kind of the illustration that's being here, because not only is he the one we're to build our life upon and we're to measure every aspect of our life and our decision making around, but also he's the one who in the end, if we do that, will never be ashamed because he'll hold it all together. It's one of those things that people worry about sometimes about, I hope that I'm not making any mistakes. I'm not doing anything wrong. I hope my faith is based upon something is true. And that's important. That's why we study the scripture, because Jesus warned that he said, if the light that's in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? If you're, in other words, building your life on something that really isn't truthful, if you're using a crooked cornerstone, if you're using a unlevel and square foundation to build your life on, and if you don't have the capstone in place, in other words, being exalted as the highest point, because that's usually where they put their symbols and their plaques and things, was on the arch, the capstone that declared what all this was about. If he isn't the capstone, then you're going to find that things are going to fall apart in your life. Now, Peter really kind of Paul goes into this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, where he talks about Jesus as the foundation. Then he says, be careful how you build upon it. And this is especially true with regard to the capstone, because the capstone is what holds everything together. And I guess I would ask you, in your life, is Jesus the thing that holds everything together? I mean, we have hopefully valuable principal relationships in our life. If you're married, it begins with the person you're married to. There's family members and all those dynamics that make the structure of your life, and hopefully they're reliable, but because they are sinners, they're not always reliable. But if Jesus is the capstone over everything, then he holds it all together. And one of the things that you really want to communicate to your friends and loved ones is that we should always begin every day with Jesus, and we should always end every day with Jesus, that every decision should begin with Jesus and should end with Jesus. It's kind of the idea that when I get to the end of what I'm doing, can I look at this and say, this is something that God has done? For my wife and I, it's like every major commitment we make of our time, our money, and our energy is always predicated in the idea of, Lord, is this what we should be doing? There are some things that are just kind of the rhythm of life. You have to get up and take care of details, and they're just part of what goes on in being living in this world. But there are other things that are decisions that you have control. It's even like when you talk about your income, that you have a lot of your income is already dedicated to the expense of supporting yourself and your family. But what do you do with the expendable income? When I say expendable income, I'm not talking about tithes and offerings. I don't think tithes and offerings are expendable income. I think God has already put ownership on that. That's why in our home, what we do is we always start by taking the tithe and the offerings right off the top of whatever we get. And we figure out how we're going to finance the rest of our existence with what we have left. And we found that God tends to multiply what's left if we honor him in that way. I don't say that as a legalism. I'm just simply saying, it's one of those cornerstones, foundation stones, and even capstones that kind of hold your life together. And so when I talk to people who are having economic problems, they're struggling to get ahead, and sometimes those are just trials that God is taking you through to increase your faith, to remind you, to teach you that he will provide for you under all circumstances. But I've also known some folks and had friends who had admittedly said to me that I was in a mess because I didn't honor God. I didn't ask first, God, what do you want me to do with my monies? And I didn't give him the top of the heap, which is what the word tithe actually means. Came to mean the 10% later on. But the whole point is that we're told in Proverbs to honor God with all of our substance and all of our increase. And so when God provides something, we recognize the responsibility to give back to God what is his. And even when I talk about offerings, it's like we are able to have extra income oftentimes, and we find that there are all sorts of people who have needs, both in our own life and relationships, but also in the mission field and other places. And God puts it upon our heart to donate and give to certain things that we think are close to his heart and that are honoring to him. And so that's the thing that you find, that when you do that, when you let your financially, you let your giving be the capstone of your life, in that sense, giving back to God, the first fruits, it has a way of holding your financial life together. And when your financial world falls apart after you've done that, and it does sometimes, it just means that God's going to do something new and amazing that you have never seen or experienced before. But I think it's crazy when people say, well, that's legalism. Okay, for you it's legalism because you don't want to do it. But I don't find it's legalism. Like I had, family and friends over yesterday after church, and I was, we cooking up hamburgers and just having a great time sharing what we had with whatever they wanted, whatever they felt like eating and whatever they needed. And, it's interesting. I didn't think about, boy, this is costing me so much. It was like, Lord, thank you that we have this available, that we can share it with others, because I just know that God will provide. Well, in my case, he wonderfully provided, because there was a leftover hamburger that my wife left for me in the refrigerator, so I can eat that today for lunch. But anyway, this is kind of a concept that isn't just a thing that we talk about. This is something that we live. And all I can say is that I'm thankful that I learned early in my Christian life that this was a way that God wanted me to live. It's so hard when you've lived beyond your means, and suddenly you've got to kind of bring your finances into control. We started early in our life honoring God with what we had, and the Lord has been faithful to keep us out of those kind of financial problems, just simply because we've waited, we prayed, and here's a crazy concept. We don't spend money on things we can't afford to spend money on. We really don't like debt and don't use debt. And I know that if you're trying to buy a house or something like that, that's probably unreasonable. But what we did is we paid our debts off as fast as we possibly could. We retired our debts. The first 30-year mortgage we had, we retired in 15. The second one we had, we retired in 9. The third one, we retired in 10. Because we took every spare dime we had to pay down the principal. Well, that's a whole formula that may or may work depending upon the size of the interest note. But anyway, our idea was, God, help us to get out of it, not to spend that money on things fruitlessly. As I heard about a gentleman that's so sad because he was saving to build a house, and then the market went so crazy that instead he just took that money and bought himself a really cool Jeep. And now he's still living in an apartment with his wife, and they have nothing to show for it. Well, you may be that person saying, yeah, that's what I did. Well, how do you get out of that mess? Let me tell you, it's real easy. You repent. You say, God, forgive me. It was wrong. Now guide and lead me and direct me in how I can begin to reorganize my life in a more livable way. Because unless you're somebody who's very skilled and gifted with financial investments and all those dynamics, well, as a matter of fact, most people I know like that, who are like that, don't do debt. But unless you are, you're probably going to get yourself overextended. Well, so much more to talk about. I'll continue more as we talk about the downside of not building upon the capstone. Although I've kind of been doing that. Oh well. We'll talk tomorrow. Blessings.